to us from Indiana. He did his undergraduate degree at Valparaiso, his graduate degree in sociology at UC Davis. He's currently a visiting assistant professor at Smith College in Massachusetts. So he went west and then now has come east.
Mm-hmm.
So we're glad he's east.
Filling out my country scorecard.
Very glad he's east. So Jared is a sociologist who studies abuses of power in government, and he combines computational methods such as social network analysis, natural language processing, geospatial analysis, and machine learning with open source and government data to uncover patterns of malfeasance by our public servants. And so he's going to talk today about some of the challenges that he's encountered and some of the strategies that he's using to overcome those challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And at the conclusion of his talk, hopefully we can engage in a dialogue with Joseph, with you ask some questions, and I have some questions prepared too. So I will turn it over to Joseph. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Joseph, and I'm here to talk about those things. Mainly, the challenges I encounter trying to do essentially social science, sociological work with data science tools. I think they can be incredibly helpful, but they are not a panacea. They are not a cure-all. You have to have a little bit of ingenuity. A little bit about me before I get into the content of my talk. I am a visiting professor at Smith. Before that, I did study sociology, and that is what my degree is in. I'm not a data scientist by training. I'm a sociologist who has picked up a lot of data science tools through my pathway in academia, which is a lot more like this than this. My research does focus on abuses of power, corruption, nepotism, those sorts of things, but I do like to get out and do some other work, some applied work specifically. I've done some stints in government, both in the UK and the US, building machine learning systems for various applications, and I'm happy to talk about that. And I try very much to find opportunities for my students to go and use data science out in the world, to sort of apply the skills they're learning, hopefully to social good community endeavors. So those are the sort of things that I care about. I'm very happy to be talking at the DSI Data Science Initiative today because I got my start with data science in a data science initiative, specifically the UC Davis one, which is now a data lab. I hear the DSI here is about to turn into a data science institute, so congratulations, that is great. I have a lot of respect for, and I feel like I need to give a lot back to these spaces because without them, I would not be doing what I do today. I would not have gotten my sort of inroads into data science without an interdisciplinary space like this. And so I hope I can give back to one of them in some way. And so I was thinking, what can I sort of bring of value to a space like this? And I was thinking about my own little Kirby Germany, as I talked about before. And typically I have been the data person in a social science crowd, but today I get the opportunity to sort of be the social science person in a largely data crowd. So that's what I'm going to be centering my talk around, is sort of the unique challenges and the perspectives I can bring from my sociology background. My driving question in my work is, how is the structure of the state manipulated by state actors or their private sector associates to control or exploit the legal environment? Put more simply, abuses of power. How do people abuse the power that the public puts in them by nature of their position, their job, the sort of prestige they have in a job title? How do people abuse those positions for their own betterment rather than the betterment of the public, which those jobs are supposed to be about? And as you might imagine, there's not a lot of data on that topic. Typically, anybody who's doing something like that is doing it really poorly if people know about it. So, my talk today is sort of 3 different challenges I've encountered while working in this sphere, this area. I'll be talking about 3 projects and mainly focusing on the challenges I encountered, not so much the research findings or the methodology, etc. This is meant to be a sort of challenge overcoming talk. And I'll talk about how I've either created my own data when there was none, I've adapted data that didn't want me to have it, and I'll end with a discussion on maybe this data shouldn't be used that I do have. And I'll hope that will be a good segue into our discussion today. All right, first project. I'm very proud of the title, The Ties That Bribe. As an overview of this project, the question was, what role do state actors play in organized crime, and how can we measure that involvement? How can we actually quantify and study this thing? A few things we knew already from the research literature is that organized crime and corruption has a symbiotic relationship. They often coexist, and they often feed off of each other and become more powerful with their connections. Essentially, organized crime is a way for corruption to turn into money. People can use and essentially sell their state power to organized crime groups to actually reap the benefits of their position. We also know that in these networks, people who have multiple layers of trust with each other essentially end up in more profitable positions. And this is true of all crime networks. If people trust each other, they can check up on each other less often, and they can sort of do the risky business that gets them paid. We also know that crime networks and all networks, the needs of those networks evolve over time. They need different resources at different stages of their evolution. So, considering all that, what sort of resources did these state actors, and by that I mean politicians, law enforcement officers, city clerks, etc., what sort of resources did they lend organized crime, and how did that change as those networks develop? So, problem with crime networks is if they can be seen, they don't last very long, as I said earlier. So how do I go about studying something which one of its principal goals is not to be studied? Well, you got to get a little bit creative. Are there any outliers that I can look at which were criminal networks but were very visible, that people didn't care if they were seen? Well, there was one such case that I decided to look at, and that was the organized crime network of Al Capone in Prohibition-era Chicago. This was a massive crime undertaking that lasted decades, that frankly just didn't care if people knew about it. In fact, Al Capone, even today, to some people is a folk hero, fighting laws that they felt were unjust, unnecessary, and beyond the scope of what the law should be doing. And he had a lot of friends, as we'll find out, in office. So, there was one case where I could look at. There was lots of news coverage. There were lots of reports. Al Capone himself was on the campaign trail with some politicians. How do I actually turn this into data that I can study in a systematic way? Well, there is no shortcut, unfortunately, but there are a lot of documents out there. There are a lot of recorded instances of these collaborations, these overlapping networks between criminal network people and politicians and law enforcement. This is one example of a sort of bit of data. This is a travel ledger which contains Al Capone, his brother, and the chief city bailiff of Chicago. They just went to the Bahamas together. Coincidentally, spent a few weeks there. Nothing happened, I'm sure. But I have a recorded instance from the time, like contemporaneous with the events, that these people were spending a significant amount of time together, spending significant money together. I believe I can infer from things like this there was a relationship between these people. By taking these documents and layering these relationships, some of them are travel, some of them are people starting businesses together and opening establishments. Some of them are people getting arrested together, because if you're doing crime together, I'm going to assume you probably know each other. I can layer all these things on top of each other to get something like this. This is the Prohibition-era crime network of Al Capone, or the Outfit, as he called it, between the years of 1920 and 1933. I have some stats over here of the pre-Prohibition and the during Prohibition era. That was significant to me for my question because Prohibition made alcohol illegal, which made a lot of money to be made by selling illegal alcohol. So the crime network got much bigger during that time. But the point here being is every line in this graph is a connection between criminals in this network. These are those co-arrests, they are the owning businesses, they are bribe pavements that got found out and prosecuted. In this network, the orange points are politicians. Let's zoom in a little bit. The orange points are politicians, the dark purple points are law enforcement, and the gray points are everybody else. By layering these connections together, I've created a data set that where once there was none. Through archival digging, through collection of recorded contemporaneous documents, I've created data where there was none before. And I will say, mostly, my co-author created this data. I was able to come in at the end and make use of all of her excellent work. But sometimes, if there is not data out there, you have to make it yourself from other sources. And that can help you look at things that could not have been looked at otherwise. Now, this was not an easy process, of course. The collecting of all of those documents and turning them into relationship data took about 7 years. Like I said, really glad I didn't have to do all of it. But there are also some other general problems because of the nature of creating this sort of historical database. One is that I have to have some comfort with ambiguity. Because while we have what we feel will be the best data source on this crime network to exist, that data we use, the sources are created by people in a certain perspective, in a certain time period. A lot of the documents we use to make these connections were news reports of the time. And they might not have cared about fact so much as they cared about sensationalism. Some things never change. So that all that information was coming from a specific perspective, which means people like Al Capone in our network got way more coverage, got way more connections. Were those connections real, or were they just what the reporters at the time could observe? It's hard for us to know at this point in time. We also don't know what wasn't recorded. We have a problem of perhaps missing links in our network, which can be fairly significant to what the network can then tell us. But there are some algorithms we can run to try and find out how bad those missingness gaps are, but we can never really know. And lastly, there were a lot of records that could have helped, but the police records department burned down in a mysterious fire in like the 40s. So all of it's gone. We did the best with what did exist. And while this does, it's not an ideal, it's not a clean, it's not a pristine data set, but it is the best that does exist. And to say, well, this isn't perfect, so we shouldn't look at it, sounds a whole lot like the story of the drunk looking under the streetlight for his keys. He probably didn't drop his keys under the streetlight, but if it's the only place he can see, that's where he'll go look for them. That doesn't mean he's going to have a fruitful search. And so it's sometimes worth it to go and deal with some of that ambiguity, to ask the questions that really matter to you or to the discipline. Next sort of case study, the one I'm working on most presently. Last one is done, this one is present, next one will be in the future. I'm looking at asset forfeiture, asset seizures in California. For those that don't know, asset forfeiture is the process by the police come, look at your thing, and say your thing is our thing now. Because asset forfeiture targets things, not people, your property has none of the protections that people are afforded in the American judicial system. Your stuff is essentially guilty until proven innocent by you in the courts. You have to petition and say, oh wait, no, I want my stuff back, and you have to go through a lot of hoops to get it. Some states have, protections, many do not. Again, in this project, we know that police use greater force in minority communities. They do not use force equally everywhere. We also know that police use lower standards of suspicion in those minority communities, and that communities with stronger social control, or rather, police use more social control mechanisms like zero tolerance policing in minority communities. Given all of this, and the fact that we know law enforcement uses asset forfeiture as a way to supplement their budget, is it reasonable to say that police will use asset forfeiture disproportionately like they use so many of their other tactics? All right, how can I go about studying this? I have a question, something I think matters. What can I do to study it? Well, thankfully, this time, the data exists. I don't have to make it. That's great. In fact, in California, the Department of Justice requires every agency to send in reports of all of their seizures every year. And they've been posting these reports online for the past 20 years at this point. Excellent. There is data out there. I do not have to live in an archive for 7 years. This reporting is mandatory, so supposedly every department has to do it. And it sounds like a perfect, complete population-level data source for this question. So, I go and ask, hello, Department of Justice, could you please give me all of your data on asset forfeiture in a digital format so that I can study it? They do not respond. Shocker. They do not return my calls or my emails. So, all right, I have an advisor who studies crime. He's got a PhD at the time. He knows people. He will go and ask them for that data. He will leverage some of his social connections, get the data that I need, and this time they do respond, which is, sometimes the lesson is it is still who you know and not what you know, but they do respond to my advisor. They say no. Great. Okay, thanks. Thanks for that. What now? Well, I know those reports exist, and I know the data is in there. So I've got a sort of choose my own adventure situation here. I could hire a small army of undergraduates to transcode 20 years of about 600-page long PDFs, which will take a very long time and a lot of money. I could write code to do it for me, or I could give up. And one of these options would have been much better for my mental health. Well, this is what the report looks like. We've got counties in California, we've got cities, how many suspects and offenses there were, how much money there was and where the money went and all that. What am I going to do to actually get this into an analyzable format? Well, because I am speaking at a data science institute, you probably figured out, I coded my way out of the problem. Several thousand lines of code for reasons that I will discuss in a moment. But I bring this up here just to say that when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Maybe I should have just hired a bunch of people to do it, because that would have made my life easier at the very least. But this is what I ended up doing. I have these reports, 20 years, 600 pages each. Each of them had a relatively similar format. We had seizures here, meta info about the seizure, the total of money that was taken, when it was taken, and then we had a separate section of where the money went after it was taken, or the value of the object they sold, where did the money from that sale go. So it goes line by line. So this seizure was $1,141. Some of it went to the Alameda County District Attorney, some of it went to the Berkeley Police Department, one of it went to a state fund specifically for asset forfeiture, and the other one went to a general state pot of money. What I did is I turned these two areas into separate data frames, and then I brought them back together later. Because if I were to try and scrape these as they were, then these multiple rows per case thing would have made things very messy. So that was the strategy I took. Look at the PDFs, take the space on the page of the info I want, turn it into a data frame, take the space on the page of the other thing, turn that into a data frame, join them together later. I'm literally using the structure of these PDFs and I'm exploiting it to create clean, digital, analyzable data. So, would I have rather gotten a bunch of CSVs? Yes. But this data has structure, even if it's locked inside of PDF reports. Now, after all that effort, eventually I ended up with a brand new database that nobody else has. Plan to publish on that for a little while. that has the number of seizures by what agency, the amount of money they got to those agencies, and I can combine it with a bunch of other information I know and care about, like the community demographics of the jurisdictions, how much crime was happening in those jurisdictions, how many drug arrests were happening, how much revenue did that jurisdiction have, because that might matter and sort of push departments one way or the other as if they're going to use asset forfeiture as a revenue source. If they already have all the money they need, well, they probably don't have to do this. I combine all this information together and I can start asking the questions that I care about, even if no one wanted me to get that data. It is all public. They just didn't want to make it easy for me. Now, I have alluded to once or twice that this was not an easy process. Some of those reports were just flat images. So they were PDFs that you couldn't highlight the text. Why? I don't know. Had to use optical character recognition to turn them digital. Many of the reports had missing data, even though these are mandatory reports everyone has to turn in every year. They just had in the header, oh yeah, these departments didn't turn any info in this year. Okay, well, it's kind of against the law, but they know I don't have the lawyers to go after them, so. Some of the reports said they had data and then were just missing. Like one county said it was in the database and you scroll down, their pages weren't there. So I had to email them and say, hey, what gives? And they eventually got back to me. So again, having to reach out to these people and hunt for data that should have been out there to begin with. A lot of my grief came from the fact that the reports change format over time, which is understandable. 20 years, it's going to change a little bit. More of my grief came from the fact that within the same document, if you look at this here, remember I was using a space on the page approach? For some reason, they didn't line up. Page to page, within the same document, all of the information just jittered back and forth a few pixels, which means my space-based approach was now broken, and I had to find another tactic to solve it. Why did that happen? I have no idea. These were obviously made by a machine. So was somebody going in there and making adjustments? It shouldn't happen. These are made by a machine. Why did they change? I spent so much time fixing this. All right, putting that behind me because it still hurts. Last project, the one I am looking to do into the future, or one of the ones on the docket at the very least. How do political donations impact the receipt of municipal services? So local area services. We know that despite being explicitly illegal, donations to policymakers influence their voting behavior. That may not be shocking, but we're fairly certain that happens. We also know that lobbyists and their relationships with policymakers affect policy outcomes, and that it affects lobbyist income. Some lobbyists, if the sort of politician they've been connected to retires, that lobbyist is forced to retire because their entire value is their connection with this policymaker and their network of people. It is a very strong, very obvious connection. We also know that local situations affect the prevalence of corruption. So the laws in the area, the economic conditions of a space influences how much corruption there is. So we know donations to large-scale leaders matter. We know on the ground context matters. But do these same mechanisms apply on the ground? Can you donate to your local council person and get the same sort of perks that national level lobbying will get you? That's what I want to know. So, what data exists for this? Well, in Philadelphia, they have a great open data portal. They have the location of every person who donates to a political cause. They have to register their donations if it's above a certain amount. We also have all of the locations where there are violations of city safety code in the city. Now, if I were, say, to look at political wards that have more political donations and compare them to political wards with less political donations, I might be able to make an argument saying if one of those wards gets better service from the city or is allowed to remain delinquent longer in their violations, those wards that have higher or lower donations, I think there's an argument to be made they're getting some sort of preferential treatment. I have a problem in that no information is mapped onto political wards in Philadelphia, but there are census tracts. How can I deal with this? Well, some data munging called aerial interpolation. Say these are my census tracts and they have the demographic information I care about inside of them. I can draw the boundaries of my political ward on top of this, take the area of the overlaps, and make a weighted average of the demographic information I care about within the boundary of my political wards. All right, I have the location of donations, the locations of violations, and now all the contextual information that I would need to control for in my models. I have the amount things contributed and their name, and I think this data should be publicly available. I think people should know who is donating to their politicians, how much, when, etc. Great. I also now have the number of properties these entities own and how long and for how many instances their properties have deemed to be unsafe. So there are like structural damage, this place could collapse, and you need to fix it. I can track how long they're open, how many of these firms have. However, I want to stop here and sort of talk about the more social aspects, or sociological at least aspects, of this work. I have this data. This is one of the easiest data sets I've had to get and work with. It was just out there. And I could do some work to match these two data sources together. The problem is, nobody in this data has a reasonable assumption that their information will be used this way. I am making a connection that no one signed up to have their sort of investments or their contributions and their violations paired together. I am doing this against sort of the understanding of anybody in this data set. And while there may be a legitimate case for saying, I think uncovering these violations is for the public good. I think if we understand contributions and violations, we can make our laws better to address it. There will be people in here who are not involved in that process at all, and they just happen to have a few connections. So should I actually do that? Like, I am doing something nobody signed up for what I think is a social good cause, but there's going to be collateral, good people, good meaning people in here. Even if I'm not releasing this information, I'm using their info in a way they didn't really consent to. So, sometimes the issue isn't if I can do it, it's should I do it? Because my questions have social outcomes. All the components of my data are public, available to anybody. The IRB doesn't care. I'm in the clear. But people in the data wouldn't expect it to be used in this way, and even if it might, I think, be a net good for society and our understanding of corruption, it's not a clear-cut, easy decision to make. So I hope this scenario might sort of lead into our discussion, because I don't think many spheres of data science tackle with the sort of ethical issues I do in my work. All right. Those were 3 sort of case studies of the work I do as a sociologist doing data science. I talked about creating my own data, adapting data that exists, and considering if I should use the data at all. The social world is complex, but the tools we have are catching up to look at these complex issues. And I hope more and more people will use them to understand the complexity and the messiness of the social world. That's all I've got, folks. Thanks for listening, and I'm open to questions. All right.
So I have the pleasure of preparing a couple of sort of thought questions for Jared, and then we will definitely open this up for questions from you. So the first question I really want to ask is, how has your training as a sociologist enabled you to think about asking the kinds of questions that you can now ask around data science? How have those two sort of interplayed? What facets of your training as a sociologist allows you to ask these unique questions that you're asking?
So my training as a sociologist, like we have like some quantitative people and we use, regression-based analysis. Some people are using some machine learning stuff, but the thrust of the education is looking at a social problem and trying to understand the mechanisms in society that make those things happen. So like I'm interested in corruption, which is like a topical area. And asset forfeiture for me is just one mechanism where that corruption plays out. So the sociological side of my education is identifying those pathways out in the world that I can look at to get to this broader sort of social question. And identifying which of those are studyable and which of them are sort of uncapturable, I think is the most useful bit of my sociological training in this data science sphere.
That's awesome. Yeah, I find it interesting to see how these techniques are growing and changing in the fields, and it's becoming this amalgamation of things sort of together, like you're talking about.
And the network study that I showed at the very beginning, I used methods that came from a journal in communications to do network simulations in that project. There was a communication study looking at gendered communication networks and how they essentially used a technique to swap the gender in their observed networks and then create null models based on that. I used that same technique, except I swapped whether or not people were law enforcement, whether they were politicians or law enforcement, and used that to create a null model of my corruption network. And even on like Twitter, the authors of this original communication study just said out, well, this is not an environment I ever expected to see my work cited. But there's room for this sort of cross-pollination of disciplines, which I think is great.
And along those lines, I was thinking about your statement of being I want to get this right, from the data person in the social science room to the social scientist in the data room. I love that juxtaposition. I often think about data science as an interdisciplinary construct, but one that's created from computing, statistics, and domain knowledge. And I think we need all three of those things to be true data scientists. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how sort of your sense of identity as a sociologist using these tools and your confidence level of sort of being either the social scientist in the data science room or the data person in the social science room. And any advice you might give to people who are in the room who are also sort of at this intersection of data science and domain knowledge, and sort of how you've been navigating that. Because I know it's a big question.
No, it's one I understand very clearly because I feel it a lot. Like when I'm out there looking for job opportunities, right, and I see data science positions that open up, like I always think, are they going to hire me or are they going to hire the person who is a data scientist who like did their entire like education in stats, math, and then computer science? And the answer I've run into is whenever I do get into those spaces, people are glad that I'm there because I'm not that person. I have some sort of knowledge of not just how these things work, but like the influence and impact they have once they're made. That's what the sociology side of me can bring to a conversation, which would be lacking otherwise. But I definitely feel, a bit of imposter syndrome because I'm not going to be the person making the next like incremental improvement on like a Bayesian simulation estimation of this network property. Like that's not me. That's not the skill set I'm bringing to the environment. But I do bring other things that I have yet to encounter a single time someone saying, I don't see how that's helpful. I've never heard anybody say it. So they could be being polite, but I do think I bring some sort of other skill set that is useful, especially as our data science systems become more and more impactful in the real world. Like, ever increasingly, you need somebody in the room who will say, yeah, we can do it, but should we? And there's a whole burgeoning field of data ethics and machine learning ethics and data science, and I think that's the right direction to be going in. And I think those sorts of people come out of the disciplines that aren't straight data science.
And would you pass along any advice to people who are maybe like yourself, not necessarily the data science person?
What honestly was like the most helpful thing for me is finding data science opportunities out in the world and learning through those experiences. Like I said earlier, I worked for a bit in the UK and the US government. Those were both through student fellowships. And going through those, not only do you sort of credentialize yourself, like, all right, you're the sociologist, but you've done data science work, so people trust you. You also work with those people and you learn from them, sure, but it also just helped me feel more secure in what I can bring to a team. And it was just a great experience to use those skills for something that's not just a paper, which I found very valuable. So try and find opportunities to actually use your skills because the need is out there. Like, you always hear about data science being used in big tech companies, but like tons of small community organizations, the campus food bank. You were talking earlier how the campus cafeteria here is using data science to look at their carbon emissions. Like, there are opportunities and groups out there who would love to have somebody with data science skills, but they can't hire anybody to do that. As a student, it's a great opportunity to go, lend your skills to these places, gain the experience you need to feel confident, and put some good back out there in the world as well, I think.
I love that tying together sort of not only the skills, but also that giving back. And I know you referenced that being in this space, and so that's really important too. I have one more question for you, and then we can open it up. I love the non-linearity as a statistician, the squiggle path that you've sort of taken, and I was wondering how maybe as your career has evolved in this really unique direction and combinations, were there decision points where you could have pursued a more traditional sociological path? What were some of the kind of opportunities, the pros and cons that you were weighing as you were making those decisions to getting to the point where you are today?
Making those decisions is a generous way to put it. Like I was sitting there weighing the pros and cons of going one way or another. I got into data science because, well, I wrote into graduate school for a sociology program, and I was going to study the Syrian refugee crisis that was happening at the time. But then there was a Meet the Faculty day where everybody came, talked about their research, and one of the faculty presented about studying criminal networks with social network analysis. And I just sat there and I thought, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. I'm going to do that instead. And so I just dropped everything I applied to grad school with and just switched. And it wasn't because I was sitting there weighing the pros or cons. I just saw an opportunity to study something I thought was important and really cool. And data science just happened to be the mechanism by which I could do that. So if anything, career path-wise, data science has always been a tool to me, not like a domain to study on itself. And so that's what's driven me towards the opportunities I've taken so far.
Thank you. We'll open it up for questions now.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. My impression about the literature in corruption in social science is mostly like they look at public procurement data, so it's very refreshing to hear you using all these innovative data sets. So I guess my question is, how do you build this landscape of data that to know what kind of data is available? Which states have which type of data? How do you know all kind of this information in the first place?
So how do I know what information is out there, what data is available? I'm repeating for the camera because I watched some old talks on YouTube and I couldn't hear the audience. So how do I know what data is out there? It's a cultivated thing. Like I have, my network on Twitter for what use it has now of other people studying this thing, and they'll share like this data set just came out. In terms of how I found like what I had, my advisor had the first crime network data set. That was hers. And like, so I got to join in on that. The asset forfeiture one was the first one I sort of made myself, and I had to sort of search it out and find it. I came across it just because somebody mentioned that asset forfeiture data exists. And I'm like, okay, that sounds interesting. And I went and I found that, okay, this data comes out as reports. At that point, I had a data set I was interested in, but I couldn't do anything with it. So the process for that was trying to ask them for a digital version of it. But after that, figuring out, okay, I know what I want to study. I know this is one of those mechanisms that I can use to study my topic. Can I create this data for myself? And I had to in that case. In terms of just out there finding it, those procurement datas they exist and people know about them, and that's why people use them so much. But there are often like more and more emphasis being placed on open governance. And so whenever I'm looking for something new, I start with those open data portals. And I start looking for what mechanisms are out there that can help me study my problem. So the Philadelphia project, I knew I wanted to study contributions, like political contributions. And when I search for that, it's always like lobbying to Congress data. But searching for those same key terms just in the Google search engine, eventually one of them came up where it started digging into local area politics. And that just sort of lit a light bulb. Like, okay, no one has looked at this before. Will this behave in the same way? And so I started looking at it, and through my pilots, it seems like maybe, maybe not. But yeah, finding the data is one of the hardest things that I do. And so you sort of, if anything, that's when I feel like an investigative journalist more than like a scholar, is you just gotta like talk with people and see what's out there. I wish there was a better answer, because I would follow my own advice, but there's not much. Mm-hmm.
And any researcher, any company has access to so many data points that we don't know exist out there and they can use. And so I guess I have two questions. One is, how are you planning to answer this dilemma?
Mm.
And how do you recommend researchers answer this question when they're scraping things off the internet?
Mm.
And doing any sort of research that may have good consequences, which may start from a good place,
Mm-hmm.
but can have unintended consequences.
Mm. So how am I going to answer my own dilemma, and sort of how do I think ahead to unintended consequences of the work my research may produce? In terms of what I'm going to do with this Philadelphia project, I'm leaning towards still doing it, but making sure that everything is properly anonymized and aggregated. Like, I have no reason to release like the names of any of the people in the data or any of the organizations in the data. It's not impactful for my analyses in this least, so I'm not going to do that. But like, the data is open, and I'm going to say where I got my data. I release all of my code on GitHub as well for all of my projects. It's up there. Anybody can download it and run it themselves. I do not know a way to stop anybody from using my open source mechanisms for their own ends. But as we've seen with things like GitHub Copilot and ChatGPT now, all of my stuff is going to get scraped no matter what. So I've decided to err on the side of being open, and hopefully sunlight is the best disinfectant. Like, hopefully the fact that like it is out there, it will be used more for good than it would be used for nefarious means, because I can't stop them anyway. So I can at least give the people trying to do good as much access as possible. Because as you said before, there's been an asymmetry. Like, corporations and governments have always had these vast swaths of data. they've had the computational resources, and they've had the ability to hire experts to do whatever they wanted with data. It is just now sort of becoming the case where we have the free and open source tools and the publicly available training, like hosted online through DSI websites and such, where individual people can start doing these same analyses that much larger entities have been doing this whole time. So I err on the side of like more openness is just going to help the individual people now trying to do this. The larger corporate government entities, they could have already done this with or without my help. And so my sort of philosophy on it is that, you know, if somebody was wanting to do this research for bad, they have the money and resources to do it already. So me sharing can only help those less equipped. And so I encourage every researcher to do sort of what I do, release all your code, release all your data, and let the people that want to do good with it do good, because they're the ones that would be stopped otherwise.
Carrie Ann?
Yeah, so in the first example that you gave with this sort of criminal network data set, and you had these like connections that were formed through different things like travel together, being arrested together, and you mentioned that the data set is like really kind of, there's a lot of quality issues in terms of like there's missing, you're missing some connections, there's sort of this like filter of like history, like what was recorded. So I guess when you're doing this analysis and some of these things, like the type of edges, like is the data good enough that you can actually like look or extract some signal from some of those things, or do you just have to like look at very broad patterns? Like how do you deal with the data being so kind of like the degree of missingness and the sort of quality and challenges that you face with these kinds of data sets, which take a lot of work to put together, but you know just by the nature of the thing you're trying to study are have these limitations, which I think are really common.
So in the context of my first project looking at Prohibition-era Chicago criminal networks, how did I get useful signal out of messy historical data? It essentially came down to what comparison am I trying to make? I can't make any comparison to like other criminal networks, which may be more contemporaneous, maybe more complete data, but I can make a comparison within this historical case I have to itself over time, because that's something I can be fairly certain is at least consistent in how it may have been flawed. So if looking at this same network pre and post Prohibition, can I see how it changed? And then within those things, can I compare the different groups within the same network? Because the missingness, I have to have faith that the missingness in my network is at least somewhat consistent within itself. So what I did is, using the communication network simulation thing I mentioned at the start of the Q&A, I took my network, my real historical network, swapped the attributes of being a state actor or a politician or a police officer, and created null networks essentially out of those swaps. So I kept the structure of the network exactly the same. I just changed what I could change, which was this individual a politician or not, or a law enforcement officer or not. Comparing those null models, which I know should be random, against my real historical observed information, is there any significance between what really happened and what could be considered a null model, a network where this attribute does not matter, keeping the shape of it and the missingness of it consistent? If there was a significant difference there, I could at least say the position of these political actors wasn't due to chance. There was some structure in here placing them and keeping them where they were at in terms of the topography of the whole network. So that's the approach that I took. I can at least say that these people were not just randomly distributed. Something was happening to put them in the centralized locations that I saw them in. So that's the tact I took.
So it's like a permutation test for your model.
Yeah, no.
Other comments or questions?
I can
Well,
ask another one before
yes.
one else.
Go for it.
Please do, yeah.
So, based on what you just shared, you seem to come from a more sociological, quantitative background, and then start doing all these awesome projects. So I'm just wondering, would you like to share how you build these computational and data analysis skills along the way? Is it project-based, or do you intentionally take courses? Like, how does that happen?
So the question was, how did I build up this skill set coming from such a sociological background? I had a DSI on my campus at UC Davis, and I went there my first year, and I just showed up a lot. I went to office hours probably every week for about 2 years, just learning R is the language I use most often, just teaching myself R. I never took a single class on data science, even though I am teaching data science now. I never took a class on it. I'm completely self-taught. And, comes with some pros and some cons. Like, I'm great at teaching data science to people who wouldn't otherwise learn it because that's how I learned. But I think that's not a particularly unique experience, especially for people my age and sort of older, because data science is just now becoming like a thing. Like, this Data Science Institute is relatively new still, and it's becoming more formalized, but like this generation, this cohort of students are going to be some of the first ones coming out with a data science degree. And so I encourage everybody to not just like see that as the end of their learning on these topics. Like, for me, I learned largely project-based. Like, there's a question I wanted to ask. I went and learned the skills to answer that particular question. And I didn't do it myself. I went and talked to the people whose job it is to know those things. But I didn't try to become those people. I took the skills, I learned what I needed, I applied it, and then I double-checked my work against those people whose job it is to know those things. But I didn't see myself needing to become an expert in each of those fields as I went along.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, though, that this is not a singular defined space, that it is, there's a lot of overlap, and that the tools are used in so many different settings. And I think your work is so illustrative of how they can be used in different questions.
And I think spaces like this are super important because this is where you can meet the people who are experts in X, Y, or Z, even if you're not. And then you can work with them and share your work and get that checking done, but learn from them as well.
Other comments or questions? Yes?
I guess I'm just interested about your path, even from your bachelor's degree was in psychology and Japanese.
Yep.
So even going to sociology from that, I guess I was interested in that kind of question.
Yeah, so my original bachelor's degree was psychology and a individualized Japanese major. It didn't exist. I had to make it myself. I started college wanting to know about how humans work. I studied abroad to make that Japanese degree, and I realized my questions couldn't be answered on the scale of like individual people. Like, the differences I saw in how people behaved between my home country and the United States and Japan, like, that's not just individual people. There are larger forces that make those differences exist. So that's what pushed me into sociology. And then from sociology, asking those sort of structure mechanism questions. To answer those, data science became a useful tool because it looks at large systems and it helps me define, quantify, and analyze those mechanisms. And so it definitely wasn't a straight path, and it wasn't always full of intention. But it's sort of making the most of the opportunities I had and what I was curious about that sort of led me along this way.
Well, thank you. That was excellent. Thank you for all the wonderful questions as well.
Thank you for having me.
So, please help yourselves. I think we have some more munchies over there at the side, and thanks for coming.
Thank you, everybody.